Introduction to Philosophy, Lecture 9. Our text skips to the end of Descartes' meditations in this chapter. Meditation 6 is subtitled Of the Existence of Material Things and of the Real Distinction Between the Mind and Body of Man. In Meditation 6, the meditator turns his attention towards the existence of the material world. However, a brief overview seems warranted since some of his intermediate metaphysical and epistemological conclusions from earlier in the meditations are operative here. As you will recall from Chapter 5, the meditator starts down a rabbit hole of methodological doubt until he's eliminated all of his past beliefs. In Meditation 2, he continues in his doubts until he finds one thing that he can know for certain, namely that he exists. This certainty that he exists will form the foundation on which he can rebuild his system of beliefs. Meditations 3 through 5 contain an ontological argument for the existence of God, but also other conclusions that you'll need to be aware of to make sense of Meditation 6. In Meditation 3, the meditator establishes that God is not a deceiver. In Meditation 4, the meditator discovers what he calls the natural light, that is our ability to recognize truth and falsity. So, anything we can clearly and distinctly perceive by the natural light must be true. In Meditation 5, he establishes that the nature of the material world, its objects and our bodies, is extension. Furthermore, none of these are perceived directly. They are instead inferred by our minds from the object's effects on our senses. Our mind's indirect access to the world through our senses is the so-called veil of perception we've discussed previously. Now, with these intermediate conclusions in mind, we can proceed with our analysis of Meditation 6. In the first paragraph, the meditator concludes that he knows with certainty that material objects and the world may exist in as far as they constitute objects of mathematics. In other words, in as far as they have calculable lengths, shapes, weights, angles, and so on, since in terms of mathematics, he can conceive of them clearly and distinctly. So, in this way, he is able to conceive of objects conceptually, but he needs one more piece for his argument to establish that the objects actually exist in a real world external to himself. This missing piece depends on his conception of imagination. For Descartes, as explained in paragraph 2, imagination is the application of the mind to the body, which is immediately present to it. On this view, imagination isn't part of the mind, but an activity that our minds make use of when it considers objects. He explains the difference between the mind's intellection and the imagination as follows. The mind comprehends things conceptually, like a triangle. The mind recognizes it as a shape composed of 3 lines or sides. The mind uses imagination to picture the object. However, as features of objects become more numerous and complicated, the mind is still able to understand them conceptually and mathematically, but it becomes increasingly more difficult for the active imagination to picture greater polygons. For example, the meditator considers chiliagons and myriagons, and in imagining these, there is no visual difference between them, but we can still consider them conceptually in the mind and understand their differences clearly and distinctly as polygons with 1,000 and 10,000 sides. Furthermore, the mind can understand this without any of the difficulties encountered in the act of imagination. Therefore, the mind and imagination must be different. Since the meditator is certain that he is essentially a mind, he recognizes in paragraph 3 that he can exist without imagination. If the body exists, and the mind is conjoined with it, and imagination is separate from the mind, then imagination is only a consequence of the mind's being conjoined with the body. When the mind considers objects of pure intellect, it turns in on itself, as Descartes puts it. But in imagining, the mind turns towards the body to consider either an original idea or an object we have perceived through the senses. Therefore, since imagination is not part of the mind, but only a feature of being conjoined to a body, the meditator can say with probability that the body and the objects of the material world exist, but only with probability. In the fourth paragraph, the meditator explains that he sometimes imagines things that are not physical in a way that makes them subject to mathematical analysis, such as color, sounds, tastes, pain, and the like. These non-mathematical or non-extended objects are perceived better through the senses than by imagining them from memory. So, to better examine them, he decides to examine what sense perception itself is at the same time to try and establish proof that these non-mathematical or non-extended objects are better perceived through the senses than by imagining them from memory. In paragraph 5, the meditator explains that in what follows, he will re-examine and re-articulate everything he had found reason to doubt in the first place, and determine what now he ought to believe. In paragraph 6, the meditator summarizes the sense perceptions that he felt so sure of as discussed in Meditation 1. In paragraph 7, he re-articulates the reasons that he developed an aversion to and a distrust of the senses, including the same misperceptions and discussions of dreams presented in the first meditation. In paragraph 8, after reflecting on what he has come to understand in the course of his meditations, he determines that he should not believe everything revealed to him by his senses, but neither should he doubt them completely. In paragraph 9, the meditator explains that he is certain that his mind is distinct from his body. After all, everything he clearly and distinctly perceives could be so as a result or as a product of God's intent and creation. Furthermore, since God could create everything as the meditator perceives it, and since God is not a deceiver, the meditator's ability to clearly and distinctly distinguish one thing from another is justification for his conclusion that his essence is thinking, or being a thinking and non-extended thing, and therefore is not numerically identical to his body, which is an unthinking and extended thing. This is a good example of the application of Leibniz's law, that if two things share all of the same properties, then they are identical. However, according to Descartes, the mind and body don't share any of the same properties. He is arguing that they only have properties that are opposite to each other, and therefore cannot be the same thing. In short, the meditator is able to conclude that, since he is his mind, and his mind and body are qualitatively opposite from one another, mind and body are distinctly different substances and not dependent on each other. This finding has interesting implications if true. For example, if the mind and body do not depend on each other for their existence, then the mind could potentially survive the death of the body, which is appealing to many theistic conceptions of identity metaphysics. For if the mind can survive the death of the body, then the possibility of an afterlife is open to us, which is consistent with many theistic notions of heaven and hell. Therefore, if we agree with Descartes that the mind and body are substantially different, then we almost commit ourselves to the possibility of an afterlife. And since the details of an afterlife are inaccessible to us, we have no way of knowing what it will be like, nor do we know whether we can affect the quality of that afterlife or how.